Through the work and doing the meditations, I've really come to realise that my body's been stuck in fear since birth, I think. And since birth, my body has had acid reflux, digestive issues, always a tendency towards sinus infections and things like that. So I've really come to appreciate through that, not only that I've sort of been living within that emotion, but also, I guess, the effects that it can have on your health. And I guess where my life sort of took a real turn, unexpected turn, was in 2016. And that's when my body completely crashed. And I guess leading up to that, there were a few things that, were indicators of where I guess it was all heading. But so for the year prior to that, I had been living in an apartment that had a mold issue. And I didn't really realise the significance of mold, or I guess the stress it can place on your body as well, particularly if you're vulnerable to it. And so during that time, I started developing really severe depression, skin rashes, chronic fatigue, anxiety, and sort of nervous tics as well. And I couldn't really place a finger on exactly what was going on. I guess following that, going on from that, I ended up going through a breakup with my girlfriend at the time. And then sort of to cope with everything that was happening, I just sort of threw myself into whatever I could to escape it. So I threw myself into work, I threw myself into the gym, just anything I could do to sort of take my mind off whatever was going on in my body and my life. So in September 2016, I was at work and my body basically crashed. I went to hospital and I had heart palpitations, and I had, the best way to describe it, I guess, is like a burning and vibrating sensation through all my insides. So I could feel all my organs just burning and vibrating, and that lasted for a good 6 months from that period onwards. So I guess I was sort of sent back from the hospital and was told that everything was fine. I think the term was ectopic beats, which was the sort of diagnosis given for the heart palpitations. But so I went home, but I knew something was seriously wrong. And going, sort of from that period onwards, there were, an endless list of symptoms that started to develop. So, from that point onwards, it ended up turning out I had chronic fatigue. Fibromyalgia was a diagnosis my body eventually got. Postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome was another diagnosis that my body received. It's also known as POTS. And the issue with that was whenever I'd go from a sitting or laying down position to standing, my blood pressure would drop and my heart rate would go through the roof, and I'd get all lightheaded and faint. And I'd have to sit back down again. And I guess over time, I started developing more and more sensitivities, so sensitivities to lights and noises, chemicals, EMFs, and foods. And I guess going on from that too, there was thyroid imbalances, adrenal cortisol cycle was completely out of whack, dysbiosis in my stomach and gut, and other sort of digestive issues. It just sort of seemed that every system in my body was in crisis mode, and it was really sort of screaming out for help, and I couldn't really put a finger on what was going on. I went to a number of doctors and was told that it was sort of either in my head or everything came back fine in some of the tests that were run. So I sort of, from that period onwards, I went for about 6 months or so, kept working and kept trying to just ignore it and sort of think it will go away, just try and fight my way through it. And that just was never going to happen. So I ultimately had to move back home with my parents because I could no longer look after myself. And so that was in 2017 when I moved back home with my parents. And for that whole time, it was about 10 months or so there, that I was just completely bedridden. I went from the couch to the bed, and that's all I did for that amount of time, because I was in so much pain and fatigue that I couldn't really look after myself. Through sort of a few other practitioners I was working with, I ultimately got onto a functional medicine doctor up on the Sunshine Coast. And so she agreed to take me on, which I was extremely grateful because not many doctors, it seemed, were prepared to at the time, because they either thought it was all in my head or they couldn't work out what was going on. And I guess as a part of the diagnosis for that, I had a neuroquant brain scan, which is essentially a program that is, or an analysis that's overlaid on top of an MRI image. And it breaks the brain scan into different compartments of the brain and ranks it based on percentiles for your age and gender. And so that scan back in 2017, by this time, came back with major swelling all through my brain. The journey was just continual, like 2 steps forward, 2 or 5 steps back, and it seemed like I was just sort of hovering and a bit lost, really. And when I first moved up here, I actually started doing some non-guided meditation on my own. I started reading a few books about meditation and Buddhism, and I just I noticed I started with 5 minutes a day, worked up to 10, 20, 30 minutes just non-guided. And I noticed it had a calming effect, and I missed all the chaos that my body was going through. Then I guess I found myself one day in a shopping centre up here, and I was walking past a bookstore, and I just bought like 10 books online. So I told myself, oh, there's no need to go in, right? You have plenty of books. But I found myself walking in there anyway, and I realised now that there was just no way that I wasn't going to walk in that day because it was just meant to be. But I ended up walking straight to the health section, and the first book I found was You Are the Placebo. And I read the back of it, and it just like the words just jumped off at me, and I was like, almost felt like it was written just for me. I related to every single bit of it. So I went home, and over the next week or so, I just couldn't put the book down, read it all. And I went then and started doing the You Are the Placebo meditations. And I started doing it twice a day, first thing in the morning and last thing at night before bed. And I noticed, like, at that time, like after reading the book and sort of starting to get into all the science of, behind it, I started to realise that, I think this is what's going to be that heals me. And so I kept doing the meditations, and then before long I noticed that Dr. Joe was coming up here for the October retreat, so I booked in for that. And I guess during that time I kept doing the meditations, but there was still, I still felt at times, some little hints of energy or contractions in my body, and I liked the way it just gave me a sort of clear head amidst everything that was happening. So I kept doing it, but I didn't have any significant, changes or anything to start with. And then I guess leading up into the October retreat last year, October I went back really bad in my health. My body really crashed again because in that time I'd been living up on the coast on my own. And October last year I'd lost close to 20 kilos by that stage. And then I went to the retreat, and I guess it was within that week that I knew this is what I've got to do. So I had some quite amazing moments at the retreat. I think the second or third night in, at home, I got home and then just was consumed by this energy that just moved all through my body. And I'd never felt anything like it. And then even to the point later in the week when we were doing the kaleidoscope meditation, the energy rose again, shot up from the first all the way to the fourth and fifth centers, down my arms and then into my head. And there was that much energy in my brain and my head in that meditation that my eyes were actually pulsing out of my head. I've never felt anything like it. My eyeballs were vibrating and just pulsing in and out, and it felt amazing. So I started to really realise then, that something significant's happening in my body. Midway through that week, being on the walking meditation on the beach with everyone walking around me, and I was just thriving off the energy, And I mean, I went from the week prior not being able to even brush my teeth to then, marching up the beach with everyone and feeling great, no palpitations or anything, and just feeling so amazing. And so I knew at that time that, you know, this is really going to be the way I do it, right? So I also had a healing at the end of that week as well, which was just amazing, and had energy move through my body again. And then I went back home and ended up staying up on the Sunshine Coast on my own again, because I now had energy and enough to sort of get me through. And after that, I then booked in for the April retreat, so earlier this year, which was about 6 months after. And I guess during that time, it sort of ebbed and flowed, my progress again. I kept meditating every day, and ever since I've read You're the Placebo, I haven't missed a day. And most days I meditate 3 times a day, because it's really been my medicine. And I guess the main takeaway I had at the October event was leading up to the last day, I still had some doubts. I guess I had doubts that whether or not this was actually working, you know, even though it clearly was, and I knew that, but just the analytical mind kicked in. And I guess then, so I then, you know, went into the final pineal gland meditation on the last day, and I was just willing to just see what happened, right? You know, and out of nowhere, you know, during that meditation, my consciousness was just ripped up through my chest. And up until that point, I'd obviously experienced nothing like that in my life. And I got the message, you either come all the way out now, or you go back into your body. And as that happened, all my hearing went distorted, and I was just aware that I was pulsing above my body, and my body was still very much laying down on the ground, but I was just in the void, in the darkness, pulsing above my body. So then I guess it was just like, after that, it was a real game changer. I mean, I was like, if I can transcend my body, I can heal my body. So after the second retreat, I then come back home and just went further all in. You know, I started getting up at 4 a.m. to chase the mystical. And, you know, since then I've had a number of amazing experiences, you know, going through tunnels or flying around in the void. I even really experienced a non-locality of consciousness when I actually became the consciousness above the backyard of my family home. And it was so crystal clear. I could see the frost on the grass that morning. I could see all the neighbouring backyards, and I could control where I went above, how far or how far around or high above the backyard. And it's moments like that have really just made me realise that, you know, tapping into something here that really is supernatural. I guess, you know, I really thought, like, you know, to really heal my body, I have to get out of my comfort zone. So I booked a trip to Portland, and it was just like, I say this every time, but those retreats are the best weeks of my life, and every retreat it just gets better. So a few main things I guess had happen in this most recent retreat was, I guess, firstly, although I'd been doing the breath every day, I hadn't been able to liberate energy through the breath. I'd experienced energy through my body, but I hadn't been able to liberate the energy through the breath on my own. So, you know, I think it was the second or third day in, the music changed, and all of a sudden, like, just I realize now the passion and intensity that needs to be there to liberate that energy. And I had, you know, energy just move all the way from my first up to my fourth center, down my arms and into my head. And I think the only reason why it stopped was because I think subconsciously I realized I was probably going to faint, so I backed off a bit. But that was a breakthrough I needed, because since coming home now, since the Portland retreat, I've managed to have that happen a number of times, and a couple of times now I sort of come to and I'm just face down on the couch, and I, you know, I feel amazing, but I'm not sure how exactly I got there, right? Because my body seems to just fold over when the energy takes over. And then I guess one other thing that was a real standout for me, leading up to the Portland retreat, my body still has a number of symptoms that are troublesome and I need to keep overcoming. And one of them has been, and with me through the whole journey, was my body's mast cells and how sensitive they were. So I'd often find myself, you know, having some sort of histamine reaction to whatever I've eaten. So leading up to the retreat, I just become determined that I'm just going to overcome it. So there was a number of meditations at home where I'd sit there and my whole body would just be itching because the mast cells are reacting to something. And I wouldn't scratch or anything. I just would stay in the present moment until all the itching went away. And then I also, once I got over to Portland a few days prior, I updated my mind movie and I thought I better work out what exactly I'm dealing with here. So I looked up, got a photo online of a mast cell under a microscope, and I saw what you could see on there, all the receptors on the outside. You could see all the granules in the middle of the cell that, you know, had the histamine and other mediators that cause the inflammatory reaction. And I put a big smiling emoji in the middle of it, and with the affirmation of, along the lines of, my mast cells are healthy and coherent, something like that. And so I started watching that, and it was about probably the third day in, I just realised, particularly at Portland, because I had to eat whatever was available, which was a first for me in many years, I just didn't have like an inflammatory reaction, you know, and I sort of then I was like, wow, this is, you know, I've just got to keep going, like keep running with this, right? So it was almost like in that moment at that retreat that I didn't have a specific sensation, but just a knowingness that like that genetic switch had been switched off, you know. And so actually still to this day, I actually no longer take, I was on for a long time, a quercetin supplement, which helps with stabilising mast cells. I've been off that now for 4 weeks and haven't had to rely on antihistamines or anything. So that's been a huge thing for me. One major thing that I got, a test result, was after the second retreat in May. So I'd had the first neurochron brain scan in about May 2017, and which showed all the swelling in my brain. And then after the second retreat in May of this year, my doctor suggested we do another one. And I had that scan and it come back like a major reduction in swelling in my brain. I'm just so grateful, you know, this whole journey. You know, I remember the first retreat, Dr. Joe said that, you know, what if the worst thing that happened to you ended up being the best thing that ever happened to you? And although my body still has a lot of healing to do, I already know that now. You know, this whole journey that I've been on is just, it's not only it's not only just sort of been amazing because I've learnt so much about myself and what I'm, you know, how limitless we are and what I'm able to achieve, but it's just changed my whole, you know, view of reality, right? So, I mean, to have all these out-of-body experiences and, I mean, you can't go back to business as normal after that. So, I'm so grateful to be going down this path, and you know, and I absolutely wouldn't change a thing.